The Appalachian Mountains look peaceful from a distance, but hikers know their silence hides things you can't explain. Strange lights, voices that shouldn't exist, and people who vanish mid-step. One camper discovered this the hard way, when a simple night by a fire turned into a fight for survival. He and a close friend set out on what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. 2 nights of camping on the Appalachian Trail. Nothing extreme, just a quiet retreat away from noise and work. The weather was crisp, the leaves golden, and the forest seemed almost too perfect. They picked a spot near an old shelter, one that looked like it had stood for decades. The wooden beams sagged, the carved initials in the walls were faded. It carried a kind of history, but also a heaviness, like people had left something behind. They built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sun bleed out behind the trees. At first, it felt peaceful, even comforting. But when night fell, the silence became oppressive. No crickets, no owls, just the sound of flames snapping. His friend joked that it felt like the forest was holding its breath. They both laughed it off, yet neither of them could shake the unease. The fire crackled weakly against the growing dark, throwing just enough light to paint the shelter walls in trembling shadows. At first, it felt cozy, 2 friends sharing stories under the stars. But as the hours dragged on, unease crept in. The woods were too quiet. No owls, no insects, no distant rustle of deer. Just silence so deep it pressed into their ears. Then, from somewhere beyond the tree line, came the sound of a branch snapping. Both froze, staring into the black. It hadn't been the quick pop of a falling twig, but the heavy crack of weight pressing down. Something big was moving out there. They aimed their flashlights into the trees, beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing but trunks, mist, and shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable, sharp as a knife at their backs. His friend muttered, half joking, that maybe it was a bear. But the words didn't match the dread, tightening in their chests. Bears don't circle slowly. Bears don't linger just out of sight. Minutes passed. Then another snap, closer this time. The hair on his arms bristled. He gripped the handle of his knife, though he knew it would do little against whatever stalked the perimeter. They whispered to each other, debating whether to pack up and leave. But the thought of walking into the black forest felt worse. Eventually, they doused the fire, crawled into their sleeping bags, and pretended to sleep. But neither of them closed their eyes. All night long, they listened to soft, deliberate footsteps moving around the shelter, never rushing, never leaving, as if whatever was out there wanted them to know it was watching. When dawn finally broke, the relief was almost dizzying. The sunlight spilling through the trees made the horrors of the night feel almost imagined, until they stepped outside. Lying just a few feet from the shelter, placed neatly on the ground, was an old rusted tin can filled with murky water. Beside it, wrapped in a filthy strip of cloth, was a lump of raw meat. They stared at it in silence, both knowing it hadn't been there before. Neither of them had left the shelter. Neither of them carried anything like it in their packs. It looked less like garbage and more like an offering. His friend swore under his breath, insisting they should leave immediately. But the narrator hesitated. Was it a warning, a test, or some local hermit's twisted way of saying hello? Curiosity gnawed at him, though his gut screamed that they were in danger. They kicked the items away from camp, trying to shake the image of someone silently placing them while they slept. But deep down, both knew the message was clear. Someone, or something, had been right there with them, close enough to touch. And as the day wore on, the feeling of eyes watching from the tree line never faded. By evening, they tried to laugh it off, telling themselves the strange gifts must have been some old junk left behind. But as the sun bled out and shadows stretched, The forest reminded them it hadn't finished. While gathering wood, his friend froze, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. Between two thick pines stood a figure. Tall, thin, perfectly still. Too far to see a face, but close enough to know it wasn't an illusion. For a full minute, it didn't move, just stood, watching. The air grew so heavy that even breathing felt wrong. "Hello?" his friend called, voice cracking. No answer. The figure didn't flinch, and then, as if it had never been there, it slipped sideways into the darkness. No sound of footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just gone. They scanned the woods for an hour, but found nothing. No trail, no broken branches, not even a footprint in the soft dirt. That night, neither fire nor flashlight could chase away the feeling that whoever or whatever they'd seen would be back. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crackle of the fire made them twitch. Every gust of wind felt like movement. Around midnight, he woke to a sound so soft it almost blended with his breathing, a whisper. At first he thought it was his friend talking in his sleep, but when he turned, the man was staring back at him, wide-eyed. They had both heard it. The voice came from outside the shelter, low and uneven, like syllables from a language neither of them recognized. It shifted as it spoke, moving from one corner of the shelter to the other, circling. Their flashlight beams caught only trees, yet the whisper slid closer until it sounded like it was right at the doorway. His friend gripped his arm, whispering frantically not to go out. But curiosity nearly broke him. He inched toward the opening, pushed the light into the dark, and found nothing. Only empty woods, silent again. They sat the rest of the night in silence, blades clutched in shaking hands. Because now they knew, whoever was out there didn't just want to be seen. It wanted to be heard. At dawn, exhaustion weighed heavier than their packs. But when they stepped outside, all traces of sleepiness vanished. Surrounding the shelter was a perfect ring of stones and sticks, carefully arranged during the night. Inside the circle, scattered neatly, were items from their own bags, snacks, a water bottle, even a pair of socks. None of them remembered leaving their packs open. The message was unmistakable. Someone had entered their camp while they slept, close enough to search through their belongings, and deliberate enough to display them as if in some ritual. His friend cursed, insisting they leave right then. But the narrator couldn't stop staring at the circle. Whoever did this hadn't just been near them. They had been in control the entire time. They packed in silence, every snap of a twig behind them, setting their nerves on edge. The forest no longer felt like wilderness. It felt like someone's territory, and they had trespassed. And as they started back toward the trailhead, the silence carried something worse than footsteps. It carried the weight of being followed. By mid-morning, his friend's nerves finally snapped. "We're done," he hissed, shouldering his pack with shaking hands. Neither argued. Every mile felt longer, each bend in the trail tighter, as if the woods themselves were closing in. And always, just beyond their vision, came the sounds. Branches bending, leaves crunching, steps that stopped when they stopped. They tried to convince themselves it was paranoia, but the rhythm was too precise. It wasn't an animal crashing blindly through undergrowth. It was something pacing them, never too far, never too close. At one point, his friend spun around, yelling into the forest, flashlight beam darting. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. Panic drove them faster. They didn't stop to rest, didn't dare eat. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, heavy with the sense that someone was right behind their shoulders. When the road finally appeared through the trees, it felt unreal, like stepping from one world into another. But the dread didn't vanish. Even as they broke into a run toward the car, both men knew it wasn't over. They slammed the doors shut and locked them, gasping as if the thin barrier of metal and glass could finally protect them. The drive down the mountain was silent. Neither dared speak, afraid that naming what had happened would make it real. Only when the highway lights flickered into view did they let themselves breathe again. Back home, they tried to forget. For weeks, the story was left unspoken, but at night, the dreams came. Both men woke drenched in sweat, haunted by the same image, a tall figure standing just beyond the glow of their campfire, watching, never moving. When they finally admitted it to each other, the realization chilled them. Whatever stalked them in those woods had imprinted itself on their minds. To this day, neither has returned to the Appalachians. They tell friends half-jokingly that they had a weird trip, but deep down, they know the truth. Something lived out there, something patient and deliberate, and it had chosen them. And when the forest goes quiet, when the air feels heavy, they still hear it. Not footsteps, not whispers, just the weight of being watched.